Hello, I'm Renee from the Bee and Bear Homestead, and I'm going to be canning up a small batch of tomatoes today, and I thought I'd show you how I do it. The most important step when canning, the very first step, is to make sure you have a really clean workspace. So I've cleaned off my counters. I'm going to spray them down again with a vinegar solution I use to clean in my home. It's just vinegar with a little bit of soap in it too, and water, and it makes a nice non-toxic cleaning solution. And then I'm going to also make sure that I obviously have washed my hands, my workspace is clean, and whatever tools that I'm using need to be really clean as well, because that's the very most important rule of canning, that you have to have a clean and sanitary workspace and environment so that your produce that you've worked hard to grow and preserve will stay good as well. So I'm just going to be making plain diced tomatoes today, and one book that I like to use for a lot of different canning recipes is Kevin West's Saving the Season. I do recommend whatever canning recipe that you're using, make sure you're using something that is, don't just get a recipe off the internet, especially not when you're canning recipes like low acid foods, combinations of ingredients, because that can be dangerous. You really should probably try to find a recipe that has been tested and improved by a home extension office, and or a good cookbook that has lots of reviews, that has been around a long time. Because again, if you can with low acid foods and you're not making sure that you're using a good combination of ingredients that have enough acidity, it may not be safe. So this is just plain diced tomatoes. It's a really good starter recipe, or not even a recipe, it's a really good starter food preservation if you are new to canning, because it's pretty hard to mess up and it's pretty easy to do it in a safe and sanitary way. Okay, I'm making a small batch of tomatoes today. I don't have very many tomatoes to can, but one of the things I like about this book by Kevin West is the recipe is per pint. It just gives you a ratio of how many tomatoes you need to make 1 pint of canned diced tomatoes. And so this one is 1 1/4 pounds of tomatoes will yield 1 pint. So I'm going to see how many tomatoes I'm starting with, and that will help me figure out what I'm going to end up with. I'm using just whatever tomatoes I have. Most of what I have are Hungarian heart tomatoes, which is my favorite. Okay, that's 3 pounds. Hungarian heart tomatoes are my favorite because they're good combo tomatoes. They're good slicers, and they're good for making sauces and canning. Okay, so that's 4 pounds, 7 ounces. And these I had cut up earlier because they had bad spots. But you can still, as long as you've cut all the bad out of it. Okay, so now I've got 6 pounds. As long as you've cut all the bad out of a tomato, I have found that it's safe to can with myself. Okay, I've got about 7 pounds to start with. So I'll probably end up with either 7 pints or maybe 6. And if it's not a full pint, you won't be able to can it, but I just save it. You can stick it in the freezer if it's not a full pint, or you can just put it in your fridge and use it later. The first step when you're going to can diced tomatoes is to remove the skins. Most people don't like to eat the skins, so you need to blanch your tomatoes to remove the skins before you can them. And I have my workspace all set up. I'm waiting for my water to boil before I start. So I'm boiling a smallish pot of water on the stove. I've got another pot set up to put the skinless and cores removed tomatoes in that. I've got a bucket of ice water here, so after I take the tomatoes out of the boiling water after the skins have cracked, you put them in ice water to help remove the skins. And I've got a nice cutting board with a sharp tomato knife. This is a knife that has a serrated edge and a really sharp point, so it's really good for cutting up tomatoes. I've got a slotted spoon to take the tomatoes out of the boiling water and put them in the ice water. And I've got just a bowl here for scraps for the cores that I've cut out or the skins. And we have chickens, so we give the scraps to the chickens. Otherwise, you can compost them. Hopefully you don't just throw it away, because it'll just go back to the dirt if you compost it. All right, I'm gonna put my first tomato in the boiling water. It's all ready. So pretty simple to get started. You just take your tomatoes and slip them in the boiling water. And then you just have to wait for the skins to crack. All right, so one skin cracked already. So I'm gonna put it right in the ice water. And the ice water will help that skin slip away from the flesh of the tomato even better. Okay, I had a few of my tomatoes crack, and I've had them chilling in the ice water. And then you can just lift them out, and you just can slip the skins right off. So after you've blanched them, the skins usually peel off really easily. And you get a slippery bald tomato. The parts that you don't want in your canned tomatoes aren't in there. So I'm taking off the blossom part, and I'm gonna cut the core out with my tomato knife. And then you can just slice it up into pieces. I usually keep mine pretty chunky. And then I'm gonna slip it into the other pot and I'm gonna have that on very low so the tomatoes don't burn, but that way they'll start to simmer a little bit and juice, and you can just kind of keep that going until you get all your tomatoes cut up and skinned, and you're gonna have a little pot of then diced tomatoes simmering on the stove after you've gotten all of your tomatoes skinned. And then you'll do the next step, which is actually the canning part. Okay, I have cut up all my tomatoes, and now I've got a pot full of tomatoes gently simmering on the stove. So here's my remnants of the 7 pounds of tomatoes I cut up. Those scraps are going to go to the chickens, or like I said, you could compost them. I'm going to clean up my workspace a little bit, wipe off my counter again while this pot of tomatoes simmers for about 5 minutes. And that also gives me time to get out my canning tools. I'm going to need a big pot for a boiling water bath. I'm going to need probably 6 pints, maybe 7, that I'm going, even though they're clean, because I always clean them, of course, after I use them, I'm going to wash them again with really hot water. And I'm going to get water started simmering on this. My tomatoes have been simmering on the stove for 5 minutes, and I have all my tools cleaned and ready to can. I have washed the rings that go on the jars with really hot water. I've also washed the lids. They're brand new lids and they should be clean, but it's just good practice to always wash everything with hot water before you use it when you're canning. I've also got some good tools that this helps get things in the jars without making a mess. This helps get the bubbles out of the jars, and also really handy, tells you the increments of headspace. So you need 1/2 inch headspace when canning diced tomatoes. This helps you touch the jars without burning your hands. And this is your jar lifter. So I have 1 jar filled with hot water that I just washed that I'm going to put in my boiling water here. So I like to get all my jars really clean and then fill them with hot water and then put them right in the boiling water bath. And that way they stay really sanitary while I am filling them. And you can see below the jars in the boiling water, there's a silicone ring. That's something I added recently because I was using a metal thing to lift the jars off the bottom of my pot, but it started to rust and it was adding rust spots to the bottom of my canning pot, and I didn't like that, so started using the silicone thing, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. It works really well. All right, let's go ahead and start canning these tomatoes. I meant to do that. Not really. All right, so I'm lifting a jar out of the really hot water. And now I'm gonna fill my clean jar with tomatoes. I'm using my jar funnel to keep it clean. I'm going to put the hot tomatoes in. Because tomatoes have various amounts of acid in them, all recipes now recommend that you add about a tablespoon of lemon juice to a pint and 2 tablespoons to a quart. I learned the hard way to add it to the middle of your jar because my jars are hot. They've been in boiling water to keep them sanitary. I'm adding hot tomatoes to it, and so that's good. But if I added that cold lemon juice to the bottom, I've had jars crack. So now I always add them. I put it in like a scoop of tomatoes. I add lemon juice and then I fill it to 1/2 inch of headspace. Kind of run your thing around the sides to get the bubbles out. Clean off the top to make sure there's no tomato residue. Put your lid on. Put your ring on. Your jar is going to be real hot, so it's helpful to have one of these jar holders so you don't have to touch your jar. And put it back in your boiling water. I have gotten all of my tomatoes into the jars. I must not have measured right, or I cut more out of the tomatoes than I thought because I ended up with only 5 pints when I thought I might get 6 or 7, but that's okay. You can see I've left the empty jars just in my boiling water bath because that way the jars don't knock around a whole lot. It doesn't hurt anything to have them in there. Pop the lid on this. All right, as soon as my jars come up to a full boil, which they're just about there, I'll start the timer. Pints require about 35 minutes in the boiling water bath for the tomatoes to be safely canned. So that's just allowing the food inside to get hot enough to kill off any bacteria that might be in it. And you want to always pay attention to the timing in the recipe. If your if your water stops boiling for some reason, it's not going to be, you need to restart your timer. So you need to make sure they are consistently boiling for whatever time your recipe says in order for you to have a safely canned product. So this is a good boil. I'm going to start my timer for 35 minutes, and that'll give me time to clean up the kitchen while my jars can. All right, 35 minutes later, and my tomatoes have been simmering the whole time. So I will turn off the heat, and you can take them out right away. You can also leave them in there and let them sort of cool down really slowly with the hot water. I'll just go ahead and take mine out. So I'm going to take the lid off. Make sure, obviously, to use your jar lifter and just lift them in. And you can set them on a towel or a wire rack on your counter. It's better not to set them directly on the counter because that cool counter might cause your jars to crack. A wire rack is really tidy, so that's usually what I use. They won't necessarily seal right away. They might take a few minutes. So you're gonna listen for the ping to be able to know that your jars have sealed. And you can see they're still hot. They're still bubbling on the inside. So now you just have to wait. Just let your jars seal. Try not to touch them while they cool down. There you go. That is a tutorial on how to can plain diced tomatoes with a boiling water bath. I hope you found it useful. My jars have cooled a little bit and they've all sealed. I can tell because there's the depression on the top is in. Really, you probably shouldn't touch your jars, or at least try not to disturb them for about 24 hours. And after they're fully cooled, about a day later, you can test them by lifting them up just by the lids. You take the ring off, lift them just by the lids, and make sure you have a good seal. If you don't have a good seal, you should eat the food right away. If you have a good seal, it will last a long time. So I'll be sharing more tutorials on how to can different garden produce on this channel. Thank you for watching. Go ahead and subscribe if you've enjoyed our videos and leave us any questions in the comments.